their break. For the next panel, we have representatives of the Alliance for Automobile Manufacturers, the American Forest and Paper Association, and the Fertilizer Institute. Mr. Schwietert, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Begeman and Board Member Miller. My name is David Schwietert, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, a trade association that represents 12 iconic car and light truck manufacturers composed of BMW, Fiat Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Jaguar Land Rover, Mazda, Mercedes-Benz, Mitsubishi, Porsche, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Volvo. Together, the Alliance members account for roughly 70% of all car and light truck sales in the United States. Last year, over 17.5 million vehicles were sold in the United States, setting an all-time record. Auto manufacturing is a cornerstone of the U.S. economy, supporting more than 7 million private sector jobs, $500 billion in annual compensation, and $70 billion in personal income tax revenues. On behalf of the Alliance and our members, I appreciate the opportunity to comment on the significant rail service delays our members are experiencing on the CSX rail network and how that impacts the auto industry and the public. Rail is an essential component of the automotive industry's national supply chain. Each day, auto manufacturers ship tens of thousands of vehicles. In fact, railroads transport about 70% of finished vehicles, and automobile traffic represents nearly $5 billion in annual railroad freight charges. Automakers utilize a combination of rail and trucking to transport finished vehicles from the assembly plant to dealer lots and ports. And generally, shipping vehicles by rail is more efficient and an economical means of transporting vehicles over longer distance versus other modes of transportation. Specifically, the CSX rail network serves several auto manufacturing plants through the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic regions, ports along the eastern seaboard, and services intermodal terminals across the Mid-Atlantic and East Coast regions. Unfortunately, since late spring and early summer, automakers have encountered significant rail service issues on the network. These service problems has caused disruptions throughout the industry, resulting in an inability to deliver finished vehicles to their customers in a timely manner. In preparation for this hearing, the Alliance surveyed our member companies to gauge the level of delays that we're experiencing, and the following is effectively a blinded bullet point as it relates to some of the feedback we had from our members. Numerous shipments have experienced 3 to 4 times their scheduled transit time as a result of sudden yard closures. Another manufacturer indicated that on-time performance decreased throughout the summer from roughly 83% in April to 60% in July. Between April and August, one auto manufacturer was forced to make 500 premium truck shipments to support the production at their facility due to CSX misconnections, the reorganization of the Memphis and Nashville terminals, and closure or consolidation of hump yards or general shipment delays. One facility had to shut down their body and paint plant various times throughout the summer due to component shipment delays, which also caused costly overruns to restore the system due to the backlog. Another manufacturer stated that CSX has ceased blocking outbound trains. As a result, all railroads had to block trains upon receipt, adding transit to each lane and impacting inbound traffic. Another commented, numerous plan changes have been implemented without a replacement trip plan for time-sensitive shipments already on the CSX network. Several automakers noted a lack of railcar supply, forcing them to incur off-site storage costs or shipping vehicles on alternative, more expensive methods. And several automakers noted that delayed shipments have resulted in additional dealer floor plan costs. Due to frequent and rapid changes to CSX operating plan, rail customers have witnessed a reduction of resources, the closing of yards and switch operations, and changes to train schedules with zero or little notice. And it is evidence that CSX operation teams are not able to keep up with the pace of the change. This has had a cascading effect on receiving Class 1s as delayed shipments are interchanged incorrectly and, at times, delivered to the wrong destination. In addition to those operation service delays, several Alliance members have expressed frustration with the poor customer service they've received from CSX while trying to address these issues. It is our understanding that the CSX automotive customer service managers at headquarters have been assigned to other duties, leaving CSX's already reduced sales team to manage customer service issues and all consumer communications, for which they are not staffed to handle effectively. Additionally, CSX management has been unable to provide accurate estimates for delayed shipments. This has resulted in the potential loss of sale for vehicles delayed in transit for multiple weeks with no explanation or update. It should be noted that CSX has released service metrics to customers highlighting dwell improvements at key terminals. However, those metrics do not capture dozens of shipments routed away from terminals to new or unfamiliar locations to bypass main terminals that have been heavily congested. We appreciate the attention the board is providing to this critical issue. Since the STB sent its initial communication in late July to CSX expressing growing concerns with these delays, things have improved slightly. However, the overall level of service remains woefully inadequate, and we are concerned that additional operational changes will be implemented, further impacting service on not just the CSX network, but also the larger North American rail network. The Alliance and our fellow members of the Rail Customer Coalition urge the board to continue its oversight of CSX. Without the transparency the board is requiring, rail service won't improve, and our members will be subject to continued delays, uncertainty, and inefficiencies that have a cascading effect on all rail shippers, the auto supply chain, and ultimately to customers. We urge the board to utilize all authorities it possesses to examine and help alleviate the ongoing service failures. As the board knows all too well, in many respects, the service delays and operational failures that auto manufacturers and others are experiencing are very reminiscent of the service delays and rail car shortages that occurred in 2013 and through 2014. Thank you again for the opportunity to offer our views, and we stand ready to work with the board on this important matter.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Acting Chairman Beckley, Vice Chairman Miller. My name is Julie Landry, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the American Forest and Paper Association. On behalf of AFMPA, I want to thank the board for holding this listening session. A number of AFMPA members have been seriously affected by CSX's poor rail service, as I will describe today. AFMPA's mission is to promote a sustainable U.S. pulp, paper, packaging, tissue, and wood products manufacturing industry through fact-based public policy and marketplace advocacy. AFMPA member companies make products essential for everyday life from renewable and recyclable resources. The forest products industry accounts for approximately 4% of the total U.S. manufacturing GDP, manufactures over $200 billion in products annually, and employs approximately 900,000 men and women. Efficient and reliable rail service is critical to AFMPA member companies that receive raw materials and ship finished paper and forest products via rail. Although some of our members' shipments can be transported by truck, for most of our members, some portion of inbound raw materials or outbound finished products shipped to customers must be moved by rail. American forest products companies operate in a fiercely competitive commercial environment, and their productivity and success requires timely and consistent rail transportation. When essential rail transportation services are disrupted, our members' supply chains are thrown into disarray, resulting in unanticipated costs and business harms. Unfortunately, this is exactly what has been happening to our members due to CSX's recent service failures. In speaking with our members in an informal survey, I have heard many stories about CSX's service failures and their effects on the forest and paper products industry. For the remainder of my testimony, I will describe the specific types of CSX service problems that we have experienced. The types of service problems experienced most commonly by AFMPA members fall into four separate categories: inadequate car supply, delayed transit times, reduced switching services, and lack of information and communication. In the area of car supply, CSX's inability to provide the requisite number of cars ordered has been a severe problem for our members over the past several months. In the first 8 months of 2017, one of our members has only once received all cars ordered from CSX. However, even more concerning for this company is the dramatic decline in order fulfillment since April. Since then, the percentage of cars provided to this company compared to those ordered has declined each month, from 95% in May to 63% in June, 53% in July, and only 44% in August. This precipitous decline does not take into account those situations where CSX did deliver requested cars, but the cars were not provided on the requested day, which also has adverse effects on our members' planning and production. The car supply shortage has resulted in the following adverse effects at significant additional expense. For one company, traffic had to be moved to alternative transportation, mostly truck, at an additional cost of approximately $150,000 per month. Additional warehousing costs have been incurred for use of external warehouses to store manufactured products until requested rail cars are provided. Production schedules have been altered at many manufacturing facilities. One company decided to invest in more leased private cars at an additional cost of $400,000. Some companies have moved traffic to Norfolk Southern where possible, adding additional pressure on the NS car supply. Another AFNPA member has also provided me with specific details regarding their severe car supply problems. For this company, CSX has provided only 25% of requested cars to one of their facilities in the southeast over the past 4 months, and only 67% of requested cars to a facility in the mid-Atlantic region over the past 4 months. This company is also incurring increased costs of $3,200 per day to address CSX's failure to provide the requested cars to these two facilities. Yet another example of a member company has complained about CSX's failure to provide the requested number of cars for their production. In fact, CSX has since placed caps on the total number of cars this company is permitted to order. Even with these caps, during a recent 9-week period, CSX only provided 70% of the requested rail cars, resulting in disruptions to the company's production. Based on the shortfall and delayed delivery of cars, this company has been forced to spend significant employee resources to track its car supply on a daily basis. This company has repeatedly attempted to reach CSX for assistance and potential resolution of the shortfalls with minimal results. Escalation of issues with senior CSX management has been required to avoid shutdown of manufacturing facilities due to a lack of car supply. Additional costs are being incurred to use emergency alternative transportation and address reduced car supply. Needless to say, CSX's poor service has interjected substantial costs and inefficiencies into this company's supply chain, and the railroad has been delinquent in efforts to address these problems. Next, I would like to talk about transit time. AFNPA members have been suffering significant adverse effects from CSX's failure to provide timely rail service. For one member, delivery times on CSX are now about 10 to 20 days longer since the CSX operational changes were adopted, meaning that the required lead time for arranging transportation has effectively doubled. CSX implemented its operational changes without sufficient notice to this company, which made seeking alternative transportation and supply options all the more challenging in this fire drill scenario. For another company, CSX's service problems have resulted in several instances where critical raw materials were in short supply at manufacturing facilities, meaning that the company was required to use emergency truck shipments to keep the facilities operational. The total financial effect to this company from CSX's service changes was approximately $1.2 million and growing as the beginning of September. CSX's service to its customers of our members has also been poor, forcing one customer that desires rail service to switch to entirely truck deliveries. One AFNPA member was required to store product in an external warehouse at additional expense in order to be able to supply the product to its customer when needed. Use of intermodal shipments temporarily has ceased to some customers altogether due to CSX's poor service. Other companies have experienced missed deliveries resulting in suboptimal product substitutions, and members have had to expend significant human capital to track late cars and address these problems with CSX. CSX's reduced or inconsistent switching services are also causing problems for our members. CSX is responsible for internal switching at several facilities at one company, but the poor quality of such switching has led this company to begin taking steps to replace CSX switching with a third party, again, forcing the company to endure inefficiencies, reduce productivity, and incur higher costs. CSX's system-wide problems also affect rail operations at the facilities of our members. For example, congestion elsewhere on the CSX system in July caused CSX to leave loaded and released outbound cars at some facilities for a week or more. Additionally, at one customer's facility, CSX's service problems have been addressed by providing replacement special switches on off-service days, causing additional switch charges for the member. Finally, AFNPA members have suffered from CSX's inability to provide accurate and timely information so that these members can track shipments and plan operations. For instance, one member is very concerned about the reliability and accuracy of data available from CSX through the Ship CSX feature. Ship CSX is intended to allow shippers to plan, ship, and trace shipments quickly and efficiently. However, this information has been incorrect at times. As a recent example, one mill recently had empty cars at the site according to Ship CSX. Yet a time-intensive one-by-one car review revealed that this was not the case. Ship CSX was incorrect. Our members need to have confidence in the Ship CSX data to effectively manage their expansive networks of manufacturing sites. Member companies rely on this data daily to understand their rail pipelines and plan operations based on expected car arrival times. Without reliable data regarding car location and movement, transportation and logistics efficiencies are severely compromised. In conclusion, AF&PA and its member companies believe that the board should continue its oversight over CSX's rail service and increase the reporting requirements imposed on CSX. Specifically, AF&PA requests that CSX be required to provide the board with weekly data on the supply of cars provided to the paper and forest products companies, including the total number of cars ordered versus the total number of cars supplied. The board also should require CSX to report on the number of missed switches at paper and forest products facilities and immediately improve its communications to companies that have service complaints, with a report to the board that tracks its responses to complaints. As part of the latter requirement, CSX should ensure its Ship CSX and other systems are accurate and up to date to help our members with planning their own operations and deliveries. The need for stronger oversight is clear, given current circumstances where self-imposed operational changes at a single railroad have caused harmful disruptions to forest products and paper companies, as well as many other companies with operations in the eastern and Midwest regions of the country. These disruptions, in turn, create adverse ripple effects throughout the entire U.S. economy. I respectfully request that my statement be included in the docket, and we will submit a copy to the board later today. Again, AF&PA greatly appreciates the efforts of the board in holding this listening session on this critically important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The Fertilizer Institute represents the nation's fertilizer industry, and on behalf of TFI, I want to thank the board for its proactive oversight of the recent CSX service problems impacting the shipping community. While many TFI members who depend upon CSX have experienced service challenges, TFI does note that some of its members have not experienced any problems, and other members have experienced problems to varying degrees. For many of our members, however, the service degradation on CSX has been and continues to be a serious challenge. Due to time constraints, my testimony today will be an abridged version of TFI's written statement, which has been filed in this docket. And I encourage you to consult that statement for additional details. TFI members began to experience service problems on CSX in late spring, which gradually spread across the CSX network, and despite recent improvements, still are affecting CSX operations. Those problems have included transit and switching delays, switching errors, and extended yard dwell times. In one instance, transit times between two facilities more than doubled, and cars sat so long that the product was ultimately rejected by the customer. The same TFI member was forced to curtail production, resulting in lost sales and costs estimated to be over $500,000. A major point of frustration has been CSX's decision to close yards and interchanges without notice. When that happened, cars were sent to these dead-end locations and often required weeks before they were turned around to a working interchange. One of our members had cars in an endless loop for 2 months, just 10 miles from the destination. Consequently, TFI members have been compelled to shift traffic to other modes, more expensive and often less efficient, when possible. A small number of members who otherwise would have suffered consequences escaped the brunt of CSX's problems because they have access to Norfolk Southern, either directly or through reciprocal switching, which has allowed them to avoid or reduce their reliance upon CSX. Beyond performance issues, Communication has been the most ubiquitous problem for TFI members. The changes implemented by CSX eliminated or changed many marketing and operating personnel with whom our members ordinarily would interact, often with little or no notice at all. There are a lot of new people to those positions, also new to moving fertilizer, and under pressure at the same time to implement a new operating plan. What makes this situation particularly difficult to understand and to accept is the fact that it has been self-inflicted. CSX decided to introduce a radical new operating plan over a short time period without proper notice to its customers and while also reducing personnel. It is a case of trying to do too much, too quickly, and with too little communication. This recent experience with CSX also has exposed certain inadequacies in the board's existing emergency service remedies. Those procedures, which were adopted following the UPSP service meltdown in the late 90s, are intended to allow a shipper to obtain direct service from an alternate railroad or indirect service through reciprocal switching and prescribed through routes in situations precisely like the recent CSX service problems. And yet not one customer has invoked those remedies during this latest crisis. The question is, why not? The problem is that even these accelerated procedures are too long for a shipper whose plant is threatened with an imminent shutdown. Often, by the time the shutdown is imminent, we are talking about only days, when these procedures can take weeks to months. Furthermore, the shipper must have a commitment to serve from an alternate railroad before they can even petition the board. But a potential alternate railroad can refuse to make such a commitment for any reason or no reason at all. Perhaps that carrier doesn't want to create precedent that might be used against it in the future, or maybe that carrier just does not want to modify its operations for what may be a very short-lived business opportunity. Admittedly, this is a difficult problem to resolve, and we appreciate some of the contrition that CSX and Mr. Harrison have demonstrated this morning. But how could this situation arise in the first place? Shippers ultimately prefer to avoid these situations entirely. They have incurred significant costs and customer relation issues. In competitive markets, shippers would vote with their business. They also could avoid the business injuries they otherwise have had to endure in this situation. When competitive options do not exist, shippers then also need to be able to obtain compensation for their losses. One option to enhance competition is currently pending before the board right now in the expansion of reciprocal switching in Ex Parte 711 Sub 1, so that more shippers would have alternatives available to them when service problems arise. This would benefit not just those shippers who are able to take advantage of reciprocal switching, but also other shippers who may remain captive to the troubled railroad. Because this would better enable the troubled carrier to handle its captive traffic and to more quickly restore and maintain fluidity across its own network by not having to handle as much traffic from those shippers who can use reciprocal switching. TFI also has included suggestions for modifying the emergency service remedies procedures in its written testimony. And one of the things we would ask the board to consider is to initiate a proceeding to seek input on how the board could be more responsive or may change or modify its alternative service or emergency service remedies to be more responsive to these situations to benefit the shipping community. Finally, recognizing that the board cannot redress every failure through emergency service orders and cannot provide competition to every shipper, we ask that the board be willing to award damages caused by service failures when such failures are of the railroad's own making. While you do not have that authority with respect to contract transportation, it is within your authority to award damages for common carrier service issues. Furthermore, standards that the board applies to common carriage often establish the baseline standard for contract negotiations. Absent a demonstrated willingness to redress service issues, through enhanced competition, emergency service orders, or damages, the board sends the signal that rail shippers are without any recourse for service failures, and that's how many shippers do feel at the moment. Despite the attention that the board is giving to these issues, there's a question of what can and will the board actually be able to do. Thank you very much for holding this listening session and for your engagement with CSX to help resolve the current service crisis.
Thank you. Dave, could you comment on the impact for the auto dealers? Because you don't ship your cars in typical cars, but rather in the stacked trailers. And I'm curious to know if there was sort of a cascading effect onto the other carriers, or do they not share those trailers?
No, that's a good question. It's not uniform throughout. I think as follow-up, I can give you some additional examples there. But obviously, it gets back to the point that, with any supply chain on the cascading effect, there was a couple comments made earlier as it relates to alternative methods that people may have to ship. You might be a captive, but just because you have the ability to potentially use something, in this instance for autos, the truck shipments, that's really a temporary recourse. That's not something that's sustainable in the long run. So at the end of the day, not all manufacturers are the same as it relates to their facilities and where they're ending up in the dealerships, but every dealer is going to be impacted differently based on that relationship with that manufacturer, based on production. If the production doesn't happen, it can have, as I mentioned in my testimony, some impacts on the floor plan financing that the manufacturer then has to compensate the dealer for.
So you say it's temporary, shifting to trucks to ship the cars.
Yeah.
And is that because of a capacity issue or a cost issue?
I think it's a combination. If you were to look at it this way, let's say your facility has a production run of 100 a day. At the end of the day, if you don't have a way to either store those vehicles, you have to idle production or slow it down. So obviously, if you choose to idle a plant, that's going to have severe consequences compared to using an alternative shipping method, which might temporarily get you out of that problem, but over the long time, it's going to be more expensive, which wouldn't be as viable in terms of, its efficiency, both in terms of total time for shipment and then also its availability.
Well, I thought each of you really did a great job as kind of capturing what is going on for the people that you represent and the specificity. Ms. Landry, you really got into so many details, and I thought that was very informative. And if I could just sort of pick up from Deb's theme this morning, if you could give us assess where things are today for you.
Yeah, for your members.
For your members,
what's the sense?
Sure, I can jump in. We have done informal surveys with our members and checked in with them on sort of a monthly basis on this issue, and I can say that for some members, after enormous human capital effort has been expended, they have seen some improvements. I think other shippers have indicated that since early spring through around September, started to see, I think, due to the board's attention to the issue, started to see some slight improvements. But I have not spoken with any member company at AFMPA who has been restored to their previous service level at this point. So I think there's still a long way to go.
And how many companies do you represent?
I'll have to double check our exact number, around 50, 55.
And do you all get the sense from the members of your associations that there's still, I don't know quite how to couch it, but like a high level of anxiety about this?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Obviously, I think the anxiety level is still there. I would note, I know Cal Dooley mentioned it earlier. He referenced a letter. I know the board was obviously copied on it. I'll make sure to include it as a result of, my testimony for the record. There was actually 46 organizations that sent a letter to Congress, copied the board, as well as CSX. Hunter Harrison responded 2 days later to the letter that was sent to Congress, basically, reiterating that there were many unfounded and grossly exaggerated statements. But I think, as you've witnessed over the last number of months, the concerns of our members aren't exaggerations. There's a lot of tangible examples that relate that there is functional problems. I would just, maybe in closing from my standpoint, articulate, having worked with the board in the past, one of the greatest things that we witnessed, whether it was in the public and business sector before Congress is the reporting mechanisms that you required previously in 13, 14, and 15 probably put the greatest amount of transparency and sunlight on a problem that then worked through certain issues. It didn't solve things, but it certainly gave people a greater degree of clarity, still reserving all of the options that, Julie and Jeff had raised as it relates to other authorities and abilities that the board has through pending matters. So I would just note that there can't be enough done as it relates to the transparency, because with the transparency comes clarity, and with clarity you can work through issues. There is a lot of speculation, particularly on the front end. Obviously, we witnessed it. We were claimed to have had unfounded and grossly exaggerated statements, but this probably doesn't resolve itself overnight. It's going to take quite some time to get back to service levels that are not only acceptable, but it's not as though any of our member companies are shipping these, products for free. I mean, we're expecting a certain degree of service, and that service is degraded, over a period of time, and it's probably going to be a while before it returns. But it's going to impact everybody differently.
I think, as I alluded to at the beginning, the TFI members have run the gamut in their experience. Some still haven't experienced any problems, others are very serious. I think the overall trend...
Jeff, excuse me, and that, when you say that, those are members who have service from CSX?
That is correct.
Yeah.
And I think the overall trend has been an improvement over the last several weeks. I think it's a cautious kind of hope that things have stabilized and will start to be going upward. But the real concern is, as we are now entering the harvest season, that's going to put additional strain on the system. Will we see a backslide? And that's what we're waiting to see.
Well, and I'll thank this panel like I have the previous ones, but we appreciate that you offer some concrete proposals for the board to consider.
Absolutely.
It's very helpful.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next panel, also of shipper representatives, will include the National Grain and Feed Association, the National Industrial Transportation League, the National Milk Producers Federation, the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association, and the Rail Customer Coalition. Thank you.
Hi, Acting Chairman Begeman and Vice Chairman Miller. I'm Randy Gordon, President of the National Grain and Feed Association, on whose behalf I testify today. The NGFA consists of more than 1,000 member companies that operate more than 7,000 facilities. Our member companies handle about 70% of the U.S. grain and oilseed crop and consist of all sectors of the industry, including grain elevators, feed and feed ingredient manufacturers, biofuels companies, grain and oilseed processors and millers, exporters, livestock and poultry integrators, and associated firms that provide goods and services to the nation's grain, feed, and processing industry. That latter category includes Class 1 and short-line rail carriers, who are associate trading and transportation members of NGFA. In addition, NGFA has 34 affiliated state and regional grain and feed associations as members. I want to start by expressing appreciation to this board on behalf of NGFA and the Agricultural Transportation Working Group that we coordinate for conducting this important listening session to enable agricultural and other shippers to convey the ground truth on what our member companies currently are experiencing concerning CSX's rail service issues. As you know, in an August 17th letter to the board, the Agricultural Transportation Working Group requested an opportunity just like this to provide additional transparency on the extent of CSX's service problems and to suggest potential future actions that the board may wish to consider. We also commend the board for convening, starting in August, the confidential weekly calls that you're doing to engage in candid conversations with CSX's senior management on the railroad service performance issues, and for posting the railroad's presentations on the agency's public website. Following this listening session, we encourage the board to explore additional ways for rail customers to interact directly with the board to point out instances in which CSX's reporting of service performance metrics may not correlate all the time with the reality. In this regard, the NGFA and the Agricultural Transportation Working Group also want to commend the board's Rail Customer and Public Assistance Office for its interaction directly with affected rail users and trying to resolve specific instances of degraded CSX rail service. This office once again has demonstrated its great value and utility to shippers. Thank you for that. Today, the NGFA wishes to make 3 broad general comments, and we also will be filing a written statement for the record. First, we want to present observations about service conditions and problems that currently are still being experienced by a significant number of our member companies that are CSX customers. Second, we respectfully want to recommend several additional rail service performance metrics that we believe the board should require CSX to report to enable the board and rail customers to better assess the true status and level of improvement in CSX's service levels. We believe that doing so will help narrow the disconnect that currently exists between what is being reported to the board versus what is being experienced by individual facilities. And third, the NGFA believes there is a legitimate question as to whether CSX's service failures in 2017 contravene the statutory requirement to provide service upon reasonable request. We believe the seriousness of CSX's service failures warrants the board requiring CSX to develop and submit a specific service recovery plan to restore service in a manner that complies with federal law and customer service needs. Let me begin by citing CSX service problems that continue to be reported by our member companies and has been echoed by other folks that have come before you today. The 2 biggest overarching complaints we consistently and repeatedly receive concern the abrupt failure of CSX to provide the reliable, consistent, and predictable service its customers generally experience prior to implementation of its new operating plan earlier this year. And second, the inability of CSX customer service personnel to respond to inquiries from rail customers. Receiving consistent, predictable rail service and obtaining ongoing, accurate information from a carrier are essential for agricultural rail shippers and receivers to operate efficiently. Prior to July of this year, CSX generally met those needs. However, our members report neither of is occurring today on a consistent basis. While some NGFA member companies anecdotally report incremental improvement in CSX's service in recent weeks, we continue to receive numerous reports that trains still typically are arriving 4 to as many as 7 or more days behind schedule. Yet there are other weeks when trains arrive at a facility absolutely on time. This unpredictability and inconsistency obviously disrupts both logistics and supply chain planning. First, it makes it difficult for facilities to schedule sufficient crews to be on hand to unload and load cars when they arrive. Second, it forces facilities that are captive to CSX to shift to much higher cost truck transportation simply to obtain sufficient supplies to continue operating, even on a reduced schedule, to meet the contract commitments they have with their downstream customers. Alternatively, it can force traditional customers to change their supply chains, either by switching products or ingredients, changing suppliers, or by adding inventory using rail cars in some cases as added storage to have sufficient commodities and ingredients available to continue operating to meet sales contract commitments to their customers. In any event, several NGFA member companies whose operations include flour and dry corn milling, feed manufacturing, and grain processing have reported having to shut down or reduce operations at plants at critical times because of a lack of commodities and needed ingredients caused by the unpredictable and inconsistent service from CSX. Let me cite a few very specific examples of service-related problems being reported to NGFA by its members. First, manifest train cycle times increased significantly in August by up to a week or more compared to what existed during the same period in 2016. Some improvement has been reported in September, but transit times remain longer than experienced during a similar period a year ago. In some cases, cars in CSX manifest service also seemingly get a tour of the eastern half of the United States after being combined with trains that traverse north, west, east, and elsewhere before beginning their journey to their intended destination in the southeast, often arriving late. Second, loaded trains reportedly wait 5 to 7 days at origin to be pulled by CSX locomotives and crews. Third, unloaded cars wait at destination for several days to be pulled from the receiving facilities, which ties up the plant's track space and unloading capability. A fourth issue involves misdirected misrouting and circuitous routing of CSX trains. I'm going to use the word ping pong after that because it's a lot easier to pronounce. Fifth, there are instances of erroneous billing instructions for shipments which result in misrouting of cars. Sixth, there are problems in resolving bad order cars and getting them removed from manifest or unit trains. NGFA has received reports that CSX sometimes changes the billing instructions for unknown reasons for cars that are bad ordered or released from bad order status, again resulting in misrouting of cars. A seventh and major issue that's begun to emerge involves what apparently is a CSX policy change that generally prohibits or routinely denies customers' requests to divert cars to different loading and receiving points. NGFA's understanding is that CSX customers previously could use a web-based platform to efficiently and timely divert privately owned or leased cars to origin or destination points within the CSX network. Now, however, it is our understanding that such requests routinely are denied for rail customers, even though CSX continues to utilize the diversion practice to its benefit with respect to its own pool of railroad-owned cars, including those in intermodal and auto service. Further, NGFA members have been informed that Mr. Harris has instructed that if a rail customer's diversion request is approved, the username linked to the CSX employee granting that request must be forwarded directly to CSX's management team, which has evidently had the chilling intended effect of ending such practices. Again, it is important to stress the differential treatment here. This CSX policy on diversions for customer cars is inconsistent with diversions it utilizes for its own equipment to its own benefit and creates costs to the shippers and inefficiencies as well. Before changing subjects, I do want to acknowledge and give appropriate credit to CSX and its agricultural and fertilizer products and operating teams for working with several organizations, including ours, my colleague Mr. Detlefsen, who will speak later with the National Milk Producers Federation, the Florida Department of Agriculture, the American Feed Industry Association, the American and Florida Farm Bureau Federations, and the previously cited RSPCA office here at the STB to expedite delivery of an overdue CSX train overnight in mid-September from Georgia to Okeechobee County, Florida, where several feed mills literally had run out of corn and other ingredients to manufacturing feed in this heavy dairy cattle area. However exemplary this action was, it was necessitated by the fact that the affected cars were delayed by several days from reaching their destination well before the advent of Hurricane Irma. And as Mr. Detlefsen will explain in his testimony, feed mills in Florida that are captive to CSX, again, are experiencing significant delays and ping-pong movements of cars that disrupt deliveries of corn and feed ingredients to that region. For our industry, the net result of these CSX service disruptions has been additional freight costs for truck movements, lost sales of commodities and ingredients, changes to supply chain and customer relationships, reduced operating efficiencies at processing plants, flour mills, and feed mills, some of which are operating at 70 to 80% of their capacity because of the lack of inbound supply, and economic losses incurred by rail car lessees and those operating private car fleets. Combined, these amount to literally millions of dollars of additional shipping costs and lost earnings to the industry. Secondly, I want to turn to recommend several additional rail service performance metrics that NGFA believes the board should require from CSX to enable the board and rail users to better track the carrier's efforts to restore service to acceptable levels. And these will be expounded on in my written statement and in a separate filing with the board. First, NGFA believes it is important that existing rail service performance metrics reported weekly by the CSX to the STB, as well as the additional metrics being requested by NGFA, be benchmarked against data for the same service performance dating to at least 2014-15 to enable CSX, the board, and rail customers to be aware of how current service performance compares to previous norms. Second, while the performance data reporting on rail service issues available on the board's website is excellent, and we commend the board for that, we believe some additional information would illustrate other service issues affecting CSX rail customers. For instance, the PDR origin dwell time metric is specific only to unit trains, as we understand it. But many CSX customers no longer have access to unit train service, given the railroad's decision to discontinue 65-car unit trains effective October 1 of this year. Therefore, it would be useful to break out PDR by unit train, express unit train, and manifest shipments. Third, given that many CSX customers now rely on manifest service, we believe additional data should be reported on the dwell time for loaded and empty manifest cars at origin and destination, respectively, with similar metrics for unit trains and express trains operated by CSX, with separate categories delineated for privately owned and leased cars versus CSX-owned equipment. Fourth, we commend the board for requiring first mile, last mile spot and pull reporting by CSX, and believe that should be retained in any future local service measurement reporting done by the railroad. But as noted previously, NGFA recommends that CSX also should be required to measure and report the time that elapses between the loaded billing of the car at origin until the actual time the car is pulled from the origin facility, as well as the time that elapses between the time cars are emptied at destination and when those empty cars are actually pulled from the unloading facility. To our knowledge, that metric is not currently being reported. Further, we believe that the board and rail customers need to know how CSX's service reporting metrics are influenced by the length of time CSX cars sit at a short line carrier's interchange point waiting to be pulled. To address this issue, perhaps it would be useful for the board to require CSX in its reporting to include the amount of time cars spend on origin and or destination short lines. Fifth, we recognize and appreciate the board is requiring CSX to report problem logs. But here again, we believe there may be a disconnect between the data being reported and ground truth reality. For instance, NGFA has received reports from some of our members that when CSX logs are opened related to service delays, once the carrier merely develops a plan for departure of the train, the log is officially closed, even though those cars actually may not have departed the facility. In addition, we have received questions on whether CSX is following through on delayed cars' transit times to destination. Sixth, we believe it would be enlightening and illustrative for CSX to report the number of employees working in specific service-related relevant departments and functions, such as customer service, sales, marketing, and by our operational area, such as train masters, division managers, switchyard employees, and maintenance crews. NJFA also wishes to commend Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue for his September 7th letter to the board, in which he cites the impacts CSX's service degradation has had on the agricultural sector. In this regard, NJFA fully supports Secretary Perdue's request that the board require additional metrics reporting, including system-level train speeds and other pertinent metrics in key traffic corridors, particularly for lanes serving Midwestern origination points and important destinations in the Northeast, Mid and South Atlantic, and Southeastern and Southern states. And finally, NGFA believes the board should require CSX to state the precise methodology it is using to calculate and report all service performance metrics. In its written statement, we'll provide some examples of why we believe that's important. Finally, as mentioned previously, NGFA believes there is a legitimate question as to whether CSX's abrupt implementation of drastic changes to its operations have significantly disrupted and economically harmed its customers, and whether that undermines its obligations under federal law. While the board thus far has refrained from instituting a formal investigation of whether statutory violations occurred, we respectfully submit that the seriousness of CSX's actions and continuing issues that are being experienced may call on the board to develop a more robust oversight by asking the CSX to take the additional step of submitting a specific detailed service recovery plan with meaningful and measurable metrics and a timetable to restore service to acceptable levels. As noted in the Agricultural Transportation Working Group's August 17th letter to the board, and this request extends beyond the board's August 14th letter to CSX to provide a detailed schedule for implementing its new operating plan for precision scheduled railroading. Respectfully, we believe the jury is still out on whether CSX's new operating plan, as currently structured, will be sufficient to restore service to acceptable levels that meet its statutory obligation and respond positively to customer service needs. In closing, NGFA again commends the board and its Office of Rail Customer Assistance for conducting this listening session, for the actions you've taken to this point, and your efforts to hold CSX accountable. We also appreciate your consideration of our recommendations, and I'll be pleased to respond to questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Acting Chairman Begeman and Vice Chairman Miller, good afternoon. My name is Mary Pileggi, and I'm the Chair of the Board of Directors for the National Industrial Transportation League and an employee of the Commerce Company, but I am speaking today on behalf of the League's membership. The League extends its sincere gratitude to the Board for all of its efforts to address the serious problems that American industry is experiencing due to the rail service failures at CSX. The League represents a broad cross-section of American business, united in their need for reliable, efficient, and competitive transportation services. Our rail members ship chemicals, petroleum, agricultural products, and paper and forest products, among other commodities. Our members operate in highly competitive domestic and global markets and have developed complex supply chains to support their operations. Reliable rail service is absolutely critical to maintaining the supply of goods required to meet the demand of the American businesses, consumers, and our economy at large. Back in July, the League collected and provided to the Board extensive information from its members regarding CSX's service problems. In the past 2 weeks, the League went back to those members and collected additional feedback from those who ship via CSX to ensure that our statement today is based on the most current information. Based on our data collection, League members who depend on CSX are continuing to experience problems in several geographic areas. To mention Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and Louisiana as a few. Generally, the types of problems include delayed and lost cars, missed switches, inadequate car supply, circuitous routing, increased transit times, yard congestion, and poor responsiveness to customer service complaints. League members are frustrated by the lack of sufficient notice of the operational changes that were imposed suddenly and unilaterally by CSX. The inability of members to plan for reduced or altered rail service created unnecessary business interruptions and forced companies to shift to more expensive truck transportation to keep their facilities running and to meet their customers' delivery demands. Where possible, members move their traffic to other railroads, but shippers captive to CSX are not so fortunate. They must endure the disruption and the higher costs. According to League members, the cost impacts range from thousands to hundreds of thousands to several $1 million since the service crisis began. Mr. Harrison mentioned today that precision scheduled railroading provides a plan for each rail car. He also mentioned a metric of achieving 90% of the plan. This target is not good enough for our members when they are measured by their customers to much higher standards. Good people work at CSX, but the railroad's overall responsiveness to customer concerns has fallen short. In the League's recent feedback, a majority of the respondents reported continuing to raise service issues, but a minority were satisfied with the response. The others were either dissatisfied or neutral regarding the CSX response. Persistent communication and escalation of problems to senior CSX personnel can help to get action and get individual cars moving again. But this is not a viable long-term solution. The League understands that the Board would like to know whether CSX service is improving, worsening, or is about the same. Based on the League's survey, the answer is mixed. The good news is that some League members reported improvements in the last month. Very few reported that service is getting worse. However, for those who experienced improvements, service has not been restored to prior levels before the operational changes were implemented. Other companies reported that their service is still poor and has stabilized at unacceptable levels that they saw in July or August. Members are concerned that the current mediocre to poor service levels may become the new normal. Therefore, we have to ask, what more can this Board do to protect the interests of American businesses affected by CSX's poor performance? We very much appreciate the efforts of the Board's Rail Customer Assistance Program in helping to resolve individual company complaints, but the magnitude of the problems and the vast number of impacted companies makes a case-by-case mediation approach impracticable. We also appreciate the board's collection of CSX service metrics, which do help the board and public measure changes in CSX's service. However, the metrics do not specifically require CSX to address the concerns of its many customers whose service is still not adequate. CSX has a common carrier obligation to provide service upon reasonable request. Does the board believe that CSX is meeting that obligation to its customers? Impacted league members do not think so. If the board agrees, then we would ask for you to consider directing CSX to add equipment, personnel, and other resources that are needed to meet the reasonable demands of its customers and its statutory service obligation. The board could help CSX's customers and monitor their compliance by maintaining closer scrutiny over the resolution of customer complaints, including asking CSX to re-emphasize the importance of the customer service function, to share the complaints from its customers' service database, to summarize the issues and shippers' concerns, to share how CSX has responded to them, and have CSX report the length of time it takes for the issue to be resolved. Where issues are not being resolved in a timely manner, the board should intervene where it has jurisdiction to do so. Finally, the league believes that expanded reciprocal switching could help to alleviate some of the service problems, and we urge the board to continue its important work in EP 711. Allowing an impacted CSX customer to switch its traffic to an alternative carrier would help to protect American industry in some situations from the disruptive and costly consequences of poor rail service. On behalf of the league, I would like to thank the board again and appreciate the opportunity to express our concerns and perspective. The league will be filing a more detailed version of this statement in the EP 742 docket, and I request that it be entered into the record. I would be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Commissioner. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Clay Detlefson. I'm the Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Staff Counsel at the National Milk Producers Federation, which represents our nation's dairy cooperatives. I'm also the co-chair, along with Mr. Gordon, of the Food and Ag Sector Coordinating Council. The Food and Ag Sector is one of 16 critical infrastructure partnerships that were set up in 2003 under Homeland Security Presidential Directive 7. The Food and Ag Sector is the largest of all the sectors and accounts for 1/5 of this nation's economic activity. While the initial focus of the critical infrastructure sectors was to protect our infrastructure from terrorist attacks, the mission was altered to address all hazards that could impact our infrastructure. Hurricanes are one such hazard. In this regard, I want to use my time to share a real-world example of CSX's service issues and to convey concerns regarding the current state of play. On Sunday, September 10th, 2017, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services reached out to one of my coworkers and asked if there was anything that National Milk could do to help get animal feed into Florida. We were told that CSX had not been delivering feed as they should, and in talking with feed mills down there, they were out of grain on Friday. This is going to get critical pretty quick. The gentleman from the Department of Ag explained that the commissioner had contacted CSX to no avail and that rail cars with grain were stuck in Nashville and in New York. I informed the Florida Department of Agriculture that FEMA and DHS Infrastructure Protection were conducting daily hurricane situation calls with the private sector and that they should consider joining us. I also reached out to the chair of the Critical Infrastructure Cross-Sector Council and gave him a heads up on the problem we are facing. By coincidence, the chair is an employee of the Association of American Railroads. He agreed to reach out to CSX and did follow through. On the situational call that day, I let the participants know about the problem and that we had hopes that CSX would be able to make deliveries in time to avoid a crisis. On Monday, September 11th, I learned that CSX had been having issues for some time and that the shortfall of grain was not related to shipments being held up to avoid a hit from Hurricane Irma, but rather part of a larger problem where shipments were commonly misdirected or late. I was told that it was not limited to dairy feed, but also poultry feed, and flour mills were impacted too. While it was clear that problems were significant, the focus had to be on getting feed grain to the mills in Okeechobee as soon as possible after the hurricane passed. For situational awareness, National Milk filed an advisory with the National Business Emergency Operations Center and FEMA Region 4 Administrator. On Tuesday, September 12th, discussions continued and broadened. I was in touch with my colleague at the National Grain and Feed Association, with FEMA, with DHS Infrastructure Protection, multiple calls with the United States Department of Agriculture, the Food and Drug Administration, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the Florida Farm Bureau, and others. It was clear that everyone understood the urgency of the situation and wanted to help. We collectively discussed the situation on the ground in Florida and attempted to ascertain when conditions would be acceptable or safe to get grain down to Okeechobee by train or by over-the-road transportation. Communications with that part of Florida were very difficult, so it was hard to get a good read on the situation. Midday, I was informed by FEMA Region 4 Response Coordination Center that they were aware of the situation and were working diligently with USDA and others to resolve it. Wednesday arrived, and we all knew the situation could get very ugly soon, but we held out hope. At 2:09 p.m. that day, I was told the grain was loaded and ready to go, but there was a power line down on the tracks in Avon Park. Shortly thereafter, I was informed that my colleague, Randy Gordon, would be meeting with CSX and would discuss the matter and see what could be done. A brief while later, Randy contacted me and asked me to set up a call with myself, the Florida Department of Ag, representatives from the STB, United States Department of Agriculture, and the Florida Farm Bureau. Randy also told us that he had been in touch with a CSX representative who stated that a train would leave Waycross, Georgia at 12:30 a.m. and would arrive later that day. Suddenly, the much anticipated Great Grain Train became the midnight train from Georgia. A lot of us had a hard time sleeping that night, wondering if our midnight train had left or where it might be. In the morning, I learned things that I had not contemplated. First, the power lines in Avon Park had not been removed. Instead, 2 cranes were dispatched to lift the power lines and allow the train to pass. In addition, I learned that many railroad crossings were not powered and people had to manually man them to allow the train to get through. In hindsight, the coordination and collaboration that must have gone on to get that miracle train to where it was needed must have been enormous. Well, I don't know all the actors that were involved that night or day. Clearly, CSX had a major role, and they deserve our gratitude for this particular shipment. I was also told by a colleague that when that train arrived in Okeechobee, practically the whole town showed up, and in some ways, it seemed like Christmas had arrived. The train carried about a 1-week supply of grain, which I was nervous would run out before additional grain was shipped in. Thankfully, in the days ahead, more grain arrived. Those shipments became inconsistent, and communications about the status were poor. I was told that folks were worried that all the missing shipments would arrive at once, and if so, there would not be a place to unload that, and that the railroad wouldn't pose demurrage fees. In recent days, I've explored the current situation a bit more, and I'm disappointed in what I'm hearing. Shipments of grain are spotty, inconsistent, and communications about what is about to be received are thin. Many times, the receivers do not know what will arrive until it arrives. They go through a fair amount of grain and feed components in Okeechobee, and freight rail is the most cost-effective way to ship it. Unfortunately, due to missing and delayed rail shipments, the feed industry has had to turn to over-the-road transportation far, far too often. That results in increased costs of up to $40 per ton compared to the contracted arrangements with freight rail. The cows in Okeechobee eat a routine and regular diet that does not vary much in quantity. The people that run the feed mills know what they need and when they need it. This should be an easy task for freight rail to deliver upon. For example, one mill knows that it needs 7 rail cars of corn, among other things, each and every week. It isn't 10 cars one week, 2 cars the next week, 14 the week after that. It's 7 rail cars a week. That's simple, that's straightforward. It's also important to note feed storage capacities are limited, and most mills can only store a few days' inventory at a time, which means they need regular and prompt shipments. It puzzles me that there are problems. One would think these grain mills are the dream customers. They have regular, consistent, and perpetual needs, which should be easily managed. Instead, I hear that rail cars are sitting in Waycross, Georgia for a week or longer, and that grain is going from Waycross to New York, down to Florida, back to New York, and then back down to Florida. I mean, they were talking about ping pong the other day. I think that's the greatest match right there. Grain has also been known to head from Waycross to Thomasville before heading south and east to Okeechobee, adding days to delivery times. I could go on with other examples. We've heard a lot today, but I think I've made my point, and others have as well. So I think you have a good understanding of the issue. The bottom line is I would like to convey here today is that CSX did an outstanding job in getting the grain train to Okeechobee on September 14th, 2017. I acknowledge that and thank them for that. Unfortunately, while CSX did a great job that day, it was delayed and inconsistent shipments that had been happening for months that created the problem in the first place. And while shipments were improved for a brief period after the hurricane, that progress is largely gone, and we are back to seeing unpredictable and inconsistent service, which is not acceptable. We still have 6 weeks left to hurricane season, and we could be right back in the same mess before you know it. CSX needs to improve, keep shipments on schedule, and provide proper customer service. The dairy industry and the feed industry demand improvement. Thank you very much.
Hi. I'm going to go next, and then it'll go back to Herman. Good afternoon, Chairman Begman and Vice Chairman Miller of the STB Board and Hearing Session Committee. My name is Barbara Cattaneo, and I'm the Secretary of the Board of Directors for the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association. The Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association was formed in January of 2016 as a result of a group of frustrated food and beverage rail shippers that felt their voices as individual companies were not being heard by the North American Railroad Network. The PERFA members formed this group with the following objectives in mind: to provide private railcar food and beverage shippers a forum and organization that will allow them to collectively advocate for rail reform regulation, including reciprocal switching, rate competitiveness, and performance KPIs. Additionally, the association members share best practices for the management of their private railcar fleets. They share common issues and concerns regarding underlying rail terms and conditions of service. They explore supply chain efficiencies within the group and with the railroad providers directly, and they collaborate with each other to develop efficient railroad network opportunities such as empty private railcar backhaul programs. Unfortunately, due to the recent CSX service issues and the lack of rail choice, our members have not been able to achieve certain goals that are crucial to the success and livelihood of their businesses. All of the PERFA members are major manufacturers and producers of food and beverages in the United States. The current state of the CSX railroad network has adversely impacted our members as the CSX service has been in disarray since the spring of 2017. Beginning in May of 2017 and without notice, CSX changed frequency of switches and routing of rail cars destined for customers in forward deployed locations. In the last few weeks, several member companies have been impacted by other unilateral changes and decisions made by CSX. The yards through which CSX now move their traffic are heavily congested, in particular, as we've heard today, Nashville, Columbus, and Atlanta. Slow movement of shipments have forced member company food processing plants to shut down because inbound products have not arrived as anticipated on the CSX railroad. These have occurred as recently as 1.5 weeks ago when a major ketchup manufacturer in Florida did not receive their inbound rail shipments, and this has been a constant issue and problem for a major potato chip manufacturer in Tennessee, along with a major food distributor in Tennessee. Our member businesses have been egregiously impacted by the CSX changes, and no one seems to care, including the CSX. Some examples of the severe CSX degradation are illustrated below, and that's the charts that I gave you there. These charts capture activity through August 31st. So we took a couple of select markets. We took Maryland, Georgia, Ohio, and Tennessee. And what these charts illustrate is the additional transit time into these areas. So, for instance, in Maryland, the transit time was increased by 6.4 days. In Georgia, the average transit time was increased by 5.2 days. In Ohio, the transit time was increased by 4 days. And in Tennessee, where our membership was impacted the greatest, it's been an additional 10.6 days in transit. We have seen some improvement in service in the past 5 weeks. However, the last 5 cars that one of our members shipped from Chicago to Tennessee just this past week for one of our food distributor members experienced delays of up to 9 days longer than the standard transit times. To compensate for this debacle, our member companies are shipping trucks to keep their businesses operating at a significant cost and complexity to their supply chains. Just to name a few examples today, the potato chip manufacturer in Tennessee has spent over $300,000 in alternative service just in the past 3 months. The food distributor has spent over $250,000. A major beverage manufacturer in Florida has spent over $500,000 in alternative transportation services, all being highway transportation. Our total member companies have spent close to $2 million just in trucking to offset the service impact caused by CSX. This does not include the other costs of carrying more inventory, additional man hours and labor needed to handle the trucks, or the cost of losing sales because product is not on the shelf. In addition to the physical changes made by the CSX to their network, they have eliminated an entire layer of field management, division management, and assistant division managers, creating a chaotic operational environment internally as well. None of our member companies can count on CSX's service. It's unpredictable. We've seen multiple changes to the service plan for customers inbound and outbound service in the last 12 weeks. We finally think we understand the new plan, and CSX doesn't follow through. There is no proactive communication or warning of impending changes. The PERFA member companies have not seen the service improvements that Mr. Harrison touted would be obvious after the Labor Day milestone. We believe there needs to be additional service recovery efforts on the part of CSX, and we need the following actions to be taken. We need to understand CSX's new service plan. What is it? What should we expect to see both inbound and outbound? Number 2, commitment that PERFA member companies will receive the service they're paying for. And number 3, ongoing direct line of communication with CSX at all levels that understand the plan and can effectively address our service issues and concerns. Lastly, we do not feel that the current STB mandate requiring CSX to participate in a weekly conference call is yielding any results for our members. We believe the data that the CSX is providing to the STB is misleading because it does not measure what's really happening in the network. We challenge the STB to garner real data from a third party and not count on the information provided by the CSX. As an example, a recent quote provided by Mr. Harrison in Railway Age magazine from October 5th states that the dwell time is currently at 11.2 hours. However, our members indicate that the average CSX dwell time is actually significantly longer. In conclusion, the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association strongly supports the STB issuing a penalty-driven recovery plan to CSX with significant impact to their bottom line if certain milestones are not achieved within reasonable industry timeframes. The lack of oversight as a result of the CSX meltdown is mind-boggling. Our member companies are angry, frustrated, and dumbfounded by the lack of serious intervention by any government agency or branch to remedy the CSX service issues in a more timely and productive manner. Thank you again for your time today and allowing the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association the opportunity to share our feedback on the significant CSX service issues and the impact that this has had on our member companies. We appreciate your listening to our concerns and ideas and solutions, and we would be agreeable to assist the STB or any other governmental agency or person that wishes to engage our help on how to better manage the CSX situation. Mr. Harrison said today, everyone wins in precision schedule railroading. We clearly do not agree with that statement. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Begeman, Vice Chairman Miller. Oh, I need a microphone. Sorry, not used to that. It's not on. Okay, am I working now? Yep. A long, tough day for the STB board, and unfortunately, you have one more customer coalition group to get through.
We're happy to hear you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So my name is Herman Hackstein, and I'm here today representing the Rail Customer Coalition, as I am the president of the Private Car Food and Beverage Shippers Association, and we are active members of the RCC. I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to speak on their behalf. First, let me thank Mr. Harrison. We haven't heard that a lot today, but I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Harrison, first of all, for the letter that he sent to the RCC that was dated August 16th. I believe that letter has been referred to several times today, and he was basically responding to some of the concerns that we had raised that we had sent to the congressional authorizing committees in the STB. I want to take a moment to clarify who the Rail Customer Coalition is, because in the letter, Mr. Harrison stated that coalitions do not have service issues, it's a quote, and therefore there is no further need to discuss service issues. To clarify, I am a CSX rail receiving customer. I'm also a board member of the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Shippers Association and now a member of the RCC. The RCC is, in fact, a large collection of trade associations representing a broad cross-section of manufacturing, agriculture, and energy industries that depend on the railroads to deliver reliable and affordable service in order to remain competitive in this global market. The members are essential to a healthy U.S. economy with operations and employees throughout the country. Collectively, they provide more than 7 million jobs and produce more than $4.8 trillion in economic output. Make no mistake, RCC members are major transportation stakeholders and the largest users of rail freight. They account for more than half of the total volume of cargo shipped by rail and generate about 3/4 of the revenue collected by the railroads. The RCC was formed because rail customers across the country are very concerned about growing problems and are being severely impacted by different operational issues, including the ongoing CSX failures. Allow me to further clarify why the RCC was formed. Customers over the years have been ignored. Their voices have not been heard by the railroads. The fact is that the Class I railroads have grown so large and so powerful that they act as if they no longer need to listen to the customers' concerns. The recent events at the CSX have certainly shown that the CSX does not believe in listening to the needs or concerns of the individual customers, as they went out and made all of these changes without consulting with a single customer. Those customers, having no other practical choice, have joined trade associations to try to get a louder voice. And the frustration, that hasn't worked. So now those associations are having to join coalitions just so somebody will hear us. Make no mistake, CSX, coalitions represent shippers, very frustrated shippers. They represent real shippers' concerns, and most importantly for today's discussion, the RCC represents about 75% of CSX's customers. So in that same letter, the RCC didn't raise the subject, but Mr. Harrison did, and that was the subject of reciprocal switching. So I thought we would take a couple of minutes today to address that. I'm not sure. His invitation was that he would be open to speaking with the coalition at any time about the subject of reciprocal switching. At this point, I do not think that there's a lot more talking required on this subject. And again, I will thank Mr. Harrison for that. We thank Mr. Harrison and his investors who are responsible for the changes that were made at the CSX. In the past several months, he and his investors have provided the strongest reason and evidence to date as to why reciprocal switching must become an option in the United States railroad system. Mr. Harrison and his investors have created a textbook nightmare case study that I'm sure many universities will be using in years to come, because it's illustrated how one industry that has too much power can stop the wheels of commerce and bring many other industries to a complete state of inefficiency. It shows how one powerful industry using monopoly power created by outdated regulatory protections can lead to the total disruption of commerce in this country. Those industries that have been affected by the abrupt changes at CSX are industries that have built their businesses around rail-based supply chain. These are companies, shippers, CSX customers that have invested in rail sidings, rail-specific infrastructure such as loading and unloading docks, and specific rail car equipment. They have built their production around the flow of reliable rail service. And let there be no misunderstanding, these companies don't have a choice to not use freight rail. They simply cannot flip a switch and go from shipping rail to shipping truck. Their entire supply chain and infrastructure is built around rail. They cannot move their rail cars across the interstate highway. As a matter of fact, I took the time to have a picture mocked up that I was going to leave of a tractor trailer pulling a boxcar down the interstate highway. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would be opposed to that. These companies don't have the choice to back a truck up to their rail unloading terminals. And they certainly can't move a tank car of liquid goods into their truck unloading dock. It simply doesn't work. Many of these industries in our coalition are companies that through their investment, they are simply all-in rail users. These are companies that should be CSX's preferred customers because they've invested in the CSX services and they support rail transportation. These are companies and industries that the CSX should not be taking advantage of simply because they don't have a choice. The CSX disruptions over the past several months have shown how vulnerable these industries are without a reliable rail option. But they're not vulnerable because of a rail disruption. They are vulnerable because the rail regulations, the powerful lobbying groups, and continue to prevent customers from having greater access to rail-to-rail competition or a choice of a last-mile rail provider when their plants are single-served by one carrier. So, again, I'll reach out and say thanks to Mr. Harrison for not only bringing up the subject of reciprocal switching and allowing us to bring that up today, but not only has he raised the level of awareness for the need of reciprocal switching, but through his distinguished career, he has single-handedly made this decision easy for you and our lawmakers to accept or pass sensible reform for reciprocal switching. See, the railroad industry and their lobbies for years have fought hard against reciprocal switching, stating that it creates operating inefficiencies. They claim it will drive up additional costs and even create unsafe working environments. The fact is that Mr. Harrison ran and operated two of the most efficient railroads in the Class 1 railroad network, the CN and later the CP, and he did so in an environment that allows reciprocal switching. The Class 1s, while under his control, had safety records and operating efficiencies that were top of class, and financials that showed operating ratios and profits that were industry best. So good, as a matter of fact, that he was hunted away from those companies so that he could come and work at the CSX. Today, Mr. Harrison has not only brought it to the attention of the STB and our lawmakers that we need reciprocal switching, he's proven to you that a Class 1 railroad can operate just as safely, just as efficiently, and just as profitably in an environment that has reciprocal switching. So let there be no mistake. The service failures that have been created by the CSX Railroad in the past several months have resulted in huge additional expenses and inefficiencies for its customers and our members. We also know that there is very little opportunity for those customers to recover the millions of dollars in additional costs. The increased costs are the price these customers have had to pay for the CSX to drive costs out of its system. I will say that Mr. Harrison's action of transforming a railroad has not created a more efficient railroad. He has simply pushed costs to the customer. If there is any good to be gained from any of this, it should be that the board recognizes that business as usual is no longer working. That an investor can simply buy his way into a railroad, operate it for his pleasure and profit, regardless of the dramatic impact that it has on the efficiency of so many other businesses. These problems aren't just going to fade away. We need your action now to stop that. Adopting a sensible, competitive switching policy is a good place to start. Doing so will help stop future service failures that result from being single-served. And, as we have seen from the CN and the CP, it will support a strong and competitive freight rail system. At the end of the day, the recent actions of Mr. Harrison and his investors in the CSX may very well be the event that drives this needed change. So for that, we thank him for bringing this very painful time of change to the American railroad system, and we ask that the STB prevent future instances of this kind. Thank you.
Thank you all. One of the sort of overarching themes that I got from this panel was the concept of holding CSX accountable to service being restored to acceptable levels. I think I probably have even said it myself, but I would love it if each of you could say what that means to you. Does it mean how it was in April? Does it mean how it was a year ago? Was it there are some shippers that I've heard from where it's never acceptable. So I would just, and I know this may be a little bit challenging since you're representing a large group of your members, but if you could just try to give me what you meant when you said it. Randy, I think you said it first here, so I'll ask you first.
Okay, I'll do my best to kind of kick this off, Acting Chairman Begeman. I think from our standpoint, one of the concerns that I think was expressed by other panelists is, are we going to be operating from a lower bar now of where service will be expected to be versus where it was prior to the institution of precision scheduled railroading? And that's one of the reasons we suggest that the current service metrics, however they might be measured against what existed in 2014, 2015, 2016. So you get a historical perspective. But I think generally from our members' standpoint, it is what I think Mr. Harrison is trying to accomplish with precision scheduled railroading, and that is to get the trains there on time, predictably and consistently. I think predictability and consistency is a huge issue, but I was bothered, frankly, by his phrase earlier this morning that we put all these customer requests into a blender and see how they come out. That doesn't necessarily to me mean that the shipper is getting the cars when they need them. And so I'd sure like to hear a lot more discussion about that method of operation. I'm concerned the shippers not come out looking like puree from that blender. I think it is that consistency and predictability of service and a much better customer service focus on communications too. That's been a theme that I think everyone from the shipper side has referenced in their testimony. So
it wasn't the same service necessarily, but service that works for your... Well,
but I think, again, most of our members would say that CSX was operating pretty well in responding to service needs in 2016 and early this year. So I think that is more the norm.
If the metrics were a match for what was happening in 2016,
I think so. I think our biggest concern is that we had that level of service, and now is it going to be at a lower standard? And that's going to be viewed as a successful outcome, and we don't think it is.
So from my perspective, I'd love to go back and ask my members that question and make sure that I'm representing it back to you. But I would say from what I've heard of the stories of our members, service isn't just delivering the car to its destination. Making sure that our shippers know what their scheduled service is supposed to be at their site, and that it's something that actually they can manage to. So if it's 7-day-a-week service, it's not something that in a month somebody comes back to them and says, oh, now it has to be changed to 5, because that's where we have our crew availability and when we look at volumes in the area. So predictability of when the switch will occur, and I would say consistency to that would be key. You heard us talk about inadequate car supply. Many of our members are not necessarily in the private rail car. They do rely on CSX for rail cars. And understanding that they can make a request through a process that says, this is how many cars I need, and they have a response back that they can plan to, that's something that needs to be consistent for them to be able to manage their supply chains.
Mary, excuse me, can I ask you for a clarification? So Sure. It sounds like what you're saying is the way things stand now, your members don't feel like they can, there's either a logical way for them to request a car or cars, Or even if there is, they're not getting a response back that allows them to know if their request has been received and is going to be honored. Is that
Yeah, they're not
what you're
getting,
saying?
I'm saying that they're not getting the cars that they're requesting, and they are using the tool that CSX
Okay.
has to request them, but they don't get them, or they think they're going to get them and they don't show up, or what happens is their switch occurs and those cars aren't brought in. So while the cars might have been in the area, they don't get them when they need them, from that standpoint. Customer service, I think people forget that the customer service function is the front line. I mean, the average shipper doesn't want to have to call senior leadership and get engaged in these. We have more important things to do. But that's the way we've had to manage the last several months. And if you think about it, the numbers of shippers represented could never make all of those calls. CSX wouldn't have enough people to handle it. Customer service is a critical function. So if you asked, what is good service? It's a customer service function that's there, that's knowledgeable of our shippers and their industries and their requirements, and actually can help the delivery. So I would love to come back and provide you more, because I could go on and on for a long time on this, but that's where I'll stop.
And I want the rest of you to answer it, but before that, if I could also ask when...
Sure.
Because railroads do have to make operating changes here
Yes.
and there, things happen. If you could, like, what do other carriers do when they make a change? How much notice do they give you? And my second two-part question is, and in your ideal world, how much notice would you want CSX to give you? Let's say for the next hump yard, it closes, or whatever you want to imagine they may be doing next.
So how much notice
Is it
do I...
2 weeks? Is it a month? What's
Well,
reasonable?
if I'm in the planning business, when I look at our business and how we do our planning, we are planning in a mode that is 24 to 36 months out. That's what we do every day. We look at our demand, we look at our supply, and we plan it out over a period of time. For anyone to think that a few weeks or a few days' notice can fit into that model, they're wrong. I would say, at a minimum, there needs to be months of communication before anything should be changed. Because we have to fit it into our supply chains, and we have to be able to manage it in a delivery to our customers. Again, that is a question that I wrote down, that we're going to get a more, I'll say, across-the-board answer for you, but notice of a greater length isn't measured in days or even weeks. It should be longer than that. And I know changes have to be made, but that's just not enough time for us to adapt. Think about what we're going through today with the trucking industry. How do we go out and find the trucks to do this? You can't just pick up the phone and call someone and say, I need 20 trucks at my facility in the next few days to handle these materials. It's very difficult from that standpoint.
Thank you.
My members and government agencies don't come to me when things are working well. They come to me when there's problems.
We know the feeling.
So basically, I was blissfully ignorant of all railroad issues until September. That tells me one thing, that basically some point prior to September, things got bad. And I would kind of defer to Randy on this. And from the conversations I've had, they're identifying that the last several months prior to September were a problem. So I would say Randy hit the nail on the head when he said in 2016 things seemed to be pretty smooth. So, but like I said, I have been ignorant about railroad issues until recently. Thank you.
So earlier today, I believe Mr. Harrison said that 50% of the cars on the railroad today were private cars, owner lease cars. So the metric for penalizing service, I think, is very easy to establish, at least from a private car user's perspective. So we can look at average transit for 2016, and we can look at 2017 transit, and the dollars that it's costing that customer is very easily quantifiable. They pay dollars per day or per month for the use of a car. We have had several members in the last couple of months had to go out and lease more cars, and I do believe I heard that from one of the other panelists today as well. So they've had to increase their rail fleet because rather than moving 10 shipments a month on 5 cars, they now need to have 7 cars to move that same number of shipments every month. They know what they're paying per day. So we've thrown the idea out, floated the idea of performance-based pricing to CSX in good times, actually, during the days of inconsistent transit, and say, your rate can be X, and your target transit is Y. If you exceed that by 5 days, you'll compensate us with a discount that's equivalent to 5 days of car cost. Very simple. It's very unemotional. And we've gone as far to those railroads and said, and if you beat transit by 5 days, we'll give you a bonus and share that saving with you. But that whole concept has fallen on deaf ears because performance-based railroading isn't really. But it's a very easy metrics. You want to know how we can quantify good service? I agree with the other panelists in saying let's look at the average of 2016. And from a money perspective, how can we penalize or how can we compensate for that? At least from a private car shipper's perspective, pay them their car cost at the very least.
I'm curious, we met soon after you created your new association in 2016. Barbara, I don't believe you are at our meeting, but so at this point, how many members do you have? I think it's a fascinating association.
So the membership is still at 15. And we're trying to keep it small because we're trying to really manage an organization that's beneficial for the members. And we had the PERF Association meeting just last week. And I want to throw something else that you just suggested, because this was the huge discussion point at our meetings last week in Dallas. So if there's shippers in the room, anybody want to tell us what the truck market looks like right now? It's tight as anything, right? Everybody out there right now will tell you that trucks are really, really tight. And people are saying it's because FEMA's eating up all these trucks because of the hurricanes. People are saying it's because of the new ELD mandate that's come in, so electronic logging. So when we got this group, because FERPA they're the Pepsis of the world, the Kellogg's of the world, the Coors of the world, big shippers. So when they're looking for trucks, they're looking for 7,000 at a time, not 10 shipments for tomorrow. They're looking at big numbers. Well, 22% of their shipments have migrated from rail to road in the last 3 months.
This is of your members?
Of just our members.
22%?
22% of their shipments have migrated from rail to road. Can you imagine what impact that's had on the truck market? Again, these aren't guys that are looking for 5 or 10 trucks a day. These are guys that are looking for hundreds of trucks a day. And they've had to take their freight and get trucks at any price because they're desperate to prevent a, we've heard it, factory closing or whatever. They're trying to prevent that. So they're paying anything. So the poor guy that's used to having a tariff rate with a trucker or a regular contract with a truck, he's paying $5,000 every time. All of a sudden, the Heinz guy that's running a plant out of ketchup is like, I'll pay you $7,000 to go pick that load up. And they're taking it. And FEMA's saying, I'll pay you $9,000 to go bring a load of water to the, to the areas that need it. So all those guys, the reason they're sensing a very truck market, a tight truck market, sure because of the hurricanes, sure because of the electronic, but I think the secret sauce that nobody's noticed, it's because of CSX. So today we're not just impacting, we're talking all amongst ourselves here about what CSX has done to us. They've affected every shipper in the country. Shippers that aren't here to talk about today the fact that they're paying 10% more for the truck this week than they did last week. It's a big impact that I don't think anybody's looking at.
Well, I certainly appreciate your appreciation of CSX's efforts in following the hurricane to make sure that those cows were fed. We were all together in Kansas City at the time that the panic button was pushed, and a lot of, I guess, mountains were moved, and it is thanks in large part to Cindy Sanborn back there behind us and her team, actually entirely to their credit, and they sort of dropped what they were doing. And of course, when you kind of drop what you're doing, and rightly so, to take care of a crisis, that has a consequence as well, as it then others have to get moved a little bit more to the back of the line. And I guess we just have to understand why that happened, a crisis is a crisis, but it really, I just really appreciate the effort that you made, and you as well, Randy, to make sure that we were aware of it. And, you know, I want to also, again, commend the Rail Customer Assistance Team. They will, you know, take a midnight call. They will do whatever they can to try to be helpful. And it's really the group that we're very proud of them. And so if you need to keep them busy, do. Although I hope that will change quickly for all the shippers. Thank you all. This is really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And our final panel consists of representatives of the short lines, rail labor, and passenger rail, including the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, the National Association of Railroad Passengers, Amtrak, Smart Transportation Division, and Virginians for High-Speed Rail.
I'm going to sit here. You want to get...
Am I missing someone? Ms. Starr, would you like to start?
I'd love to start. Thank you, Chairman Begeman and Vice Chair Miller. Thank you very much for having us here today. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I particularly appreciate being on the fifth panel. It is my pleasure to be here today. My name is Linda Bauer-Dar, and I am president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. We are the national trade association representing the nation's 600 Class 2 and 3 railroads, commonly referred to as short lines. Most short line railroads operating in the U.S. today are small and locally based. Together, short line railroads operate just under 47,500 route miles, or nearly one-third of the national railroad network. Short lines operate in 49 states, and in 36 of those states, they operate at least one-quarter of the state's total rail network, and in 5 states, they operate 100% of the state's rail network. Short lines are often called, as they have been today, the first mile, last mile operators of the nation's railroad system, as they handle the origin or destination of nearly 1 out of every 5 rail cars moving on the national system. The vast majority of these cars are interchanged by the short lines to Class 1 railroads, such as CSX Transportation. Of our member railroads, 147 are interchange partners with CSX. While CSX has been working over the last few months to restore its level of service to its customers, including short lines, our members and their customers have suffered and continue to suffer adverse impacts as a result of CSX service disruptions. Since June of this year, and I'll admit I had to go to speech therapy for saying my S's when I was in elementary school, so that was really a mouthful for me. Since June of this year, we have been supporting our members and reaching out to CSX on their behalf, and we have also encouraged them to reach out directly to CSX in regard to these service issues. While we are concerned about CSX service to our railroad members and their customers, we also want to support them in making their network better. We are committed to an atmosphere of transparency and an open dialogue and ways of improving service. We believe that collaboration and communication are of primary importance to our business model as short lines and to the rail network overall. We applaud CSX for taking steps within the last 30 to 45 days to stabilize the railroad, to slow the pace of change, and to increase communications with short lines. Of note, CSX has established a series of conference calls to keep short lines up to date, and they have sent representatives to our regional meetings to continue that outreach, including a planned presentation by Frederick Eliason later this month at our regional meeting in Providence. Personally, I've spoken with Mr. Eliason twice in recent weeks, and I think I and all of my members have experienced a stepped-up level of outreach from a number of key CSX executives of late. My members, as fellow railroaders, While impacted by this disruption, they understand the impact of any change on the rail network, let alone a change of this magnitude. It is a difficult Rubik's Cube of a situation for anyone, and for any one railroad to implement a change of this magnitude in such an interconnected and complex network is bound to be problematic. Prior to this board's listening session, originally scheduled for September 12th, we surveyed our railroad members that interchange traffic with CSX. After the session was postponed, we prepared a follow-up that was completed just last week. In particular, we asked for feedback on the potential for short-line railroad revenues to be put in jeopardy because of CSX service disruptions, their loss to date due to service disruption, and then lost opportunities for the future. Historically, CSX has had more short-line partners than any other Class I railroad. So their success is inextricably linked to short-line success, and the continued fluidity of interchange is critical to the viability of the short lines and to the communities they serve. For some of our railroads, CSX is their only interchange partner. Short lines have worked hard historically to establish service levels that work well operationally for the railroads, including CSX, and for our customers. When the CSX service disruptions began, we reached out to our member short lines to gauge the impact. In response to the initial survey, about half of our CSX short-line partner railroads responded, and when we resurveyed, that number dropped to about 20%. On average, the surveys showed that approximately 97% of short lines had experienced service disruptions. When asked in both surveys what percentage of total revenue is derived from CSX interchange traffic, 67% said that this revenue represented 50% or more of their overall business. 22% said it represented 100% of their interchange business. In the second survey, when asked whether the disruption continues, 8% said the problems have been resolved, 43% said some problems had been resolved while others have appeared, and 50% say that they continue to have problems. It's unclear what may have been the response if all the respondents from the first survey had completed the second, but generally things seem to be marginally trending in a positive direction, though considerable problems remain. 71% of short lines in the initial survey said that they had lost revenue due to CSX service disruptions, and 24% said that they had lost customers. In the follow-up survey, 20% reported winning those customers back, but 80% did not. When asked what percentage of their CSX interchange revenue was negatively impacted by service issues and operating changes, a quarter of those surveyed said that 100% of their revenue had been negatively impacted. A third said that 25 to 50% of their CSX interchange revenue had been impacted, and the remainder said that less than 25% had been negatively impacted. In dollar terms, the losses for some of our smaller railroads have been in the high hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of these railroads have revenues annually of $2 to $3 million, so a loss of that magnitude can be devastating, and frankly, it threatens their continued existence. Specifically, short lines have reported the following types of service problems: interchange delays, transit delays, unilateral changes in routing by CSX, yard delays, and a lot of cars lost in transit. Some have reported hundreds of cars lost in transit, transit time more than doubling, added operational costs due to wasted crew time waiting at interchanges, and the need to lease or purchase additional cars or locomotives to make up for those that CSX took out of operation at their location. Continuation of these kinds of problems long-term could be ruinous to short lines. Again, while CSX has improved service in the last 2 months, problems for our members and their customers continue. If they cannot obtain regular, reliable, on-time service from their Class I partner, we worry that their customers will flee to other methods of shipping their products. The Wall Street Journal reported that as a result of CSX's deteriorating service, a number of shippers have, at least in the short run, diverted traffic previously handled by CSX in conjunction with short lines to trucks, and certainly we heard a lot of that today. Transport Topics cited an independent poll that asked shippers what would happen to their shipments in the future if CSX's service did not improve to previous levels, and the poll indicates that competing railroads and other modes of transportation would capture that freight. Both our initial survey and the follow-up survey support that, and movement off of rail and onto trucks is perhaps the most off-cited concern for our short-line railroads. Some call us the truckers of the railroad industry. 61% of the respondents reported they had lost opportunities to provide new or additional rail service to customers. Their comments in the survey echo the same concerns registered in the first survey. Here are 2 quotes from the second survey. Customers cannot depend on timely delivery schedule and have turned back to trucks. And cars for CSX interchange sitting an average of 6 days before being pulled. Paper and steel customers going to trucks on account of a lack of empties to load. To the extent to which freight is diverted from railroad to trucks, the public suffers the negative consequences of greater wear and tear on the nation's infrastructure, congestion, and environmental impacts. While it's difficult to quantify the loss of revenue from new rail business, it is fair to say that as the economy rebounds, the rail freight market stands to gain, and as our short lines are poised to build on their service to their customers, unfortunately, there has been a chilling effect resulting from the CSX service disruption as shippers question the overall reliability of rail service. We applaud both the efforts of CSX to fix the service problems, and we applaud the STB for providing interested parties the opportunity to share their thoughts on the service disruptions. We believe that CSX can work to address these concerns successfully. We urge them to do so. We want to play whatever part we can to get the freight to the shipper and to take care of these service disruptions and to get the freight back on the rail network where it belongs. And I do just want to say before I close, I spent the day yesterday at CSX headquarters in Jacksonville. There is no lack of effort of very smart people at their headquarters trying to do whatever they can to deal with these service disruptions. And they are dedicated employees, and I think that, it's in our best interest to wish them all well and do what we can to fix this problem, because ultimately we all benefit from that. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Chairman Begeman, Commissioner Miller, good afternoon, and thank you for hanging in to the bitter end with us. It's an honor to be here today on behalf of the members of the National Association of Railroad Passengers, the nation's oldest and largest organization, speaking for the nearly 40 million users of passenger trains and rail transit. We've worked since 1967 to expand the quality and quantity of passenger rail in the U.S., and our work is supported by more than 28,000 individual members nationwide. I've led the Rail Passengers Association for the past 3 years, and I've worked in the transportation industry for some 30 years before that. I have a long-held personal interest in building a connected America that supports economic mobility and gives all communities, large and small, urban and rural, the opportunity to share in the American experience across this great nation. Let me begin by thanking the board for convening this session to give us the opportunity to comment on the recent network delays that have hurt users of CSX Transportation's network. The state of play today is this. Number one, passengers are stuck with eroding intercity service as host railroads have ignored statutorily mandated obligations to provide preferential dispatching to Amtrak trains. It's often said that passenger trains serve as the canary in the coal mine for railroad operations, and when host operations degrade, passengers notice and suffer. And with that fact in mind, our organization, like the shippers you've heard here today, is sounding an alarm, and not just about CSX's network, but about host railroads across the national network. Now, the numbers, as you've heard today, tell a convincing story. Only 43% of passengers on Amtrak's long-distance trains today arrive at their destinations on time. The overwhelming majority of those delays are host responsible, with 70% resulting from causes such as freight train interference and slow orders. But the numbers aren't the only way to tell this story. There's the story of Christy Roberson, Beckley, West Virginia. She rode the Cardinal to see her grandson's baseball game. Christy's grandson asked her to walk onto the field with him as part of the introductions, but hours stuck behind a CSX train meant she missed the start of that game and never got to share that moment with her grandson. There's the story of Philip Ferlino from Silver Spring, Maryland, whose daily commute home has grown longer and longer because of delays to his MARC train that uses CSX tracks. There's the story of Tom Gersh from Quincy, Massachusetts, whose 6-hour delay behind a parked CSX train on the Lakeshore Limited turned a quick business trip into an all-night ordeal. There's the story told by Alan Brougham on behalf of the Amish families he sees on nearly every long-distance train he rides. And when he talks to these Amish families, they tell him that the train is the only connection they have to their family and to medical services, and he's concerned what the delays mean to them. Alan writes, quote, "The Amish do not have a lobbying group. They're not likely to join organizations having a political agenda. Still, they are worthy of respect in the eyes of those interested in the traveling welfare of all of our citizens, something that ought to be noted in any discussion of Amtrak." And we've also heard from scores of our members who've had first-time passengers tell them never again after experiencing these delays. And these examples I've just read to you are just a small sample of the hundreds of delay stories we heard from passengers this summer that are directly attributable to CSX freight trains. And there are thousands more that our members have conveyed to us, and directly to the STB, about delays from across the national network. And especially in flyover country, many of these passengers, like the captive shippers we've heard from today, have no other option, either because of geography or for medical reasons. This is their only choice. Number two, a confusing string of conflicting federal court rulings has created a gap in federal oversight, thwarting congressionally mandated protections for passenger rail service. When Congress established Amtrak to relieve railroads of passenger services responsibilities, it provided that intercity passenger trains would generally take preference over freight transportation in using a rail line, crossing, or junction. Now, this law, 49 U.S. Code 24308C, is still on the books. And in 2008, Congress enacted the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, directing Amtrak and the Federal Railroad Administration to develop jointly metrics and standards for measuring the performance of intercity passenger rail operations. Now, extensive litigation brought by the Association of American Railroads and individual freight railroads has stalled the OTP standards process. A confusing string of conflicting federal court rulings has created a gap in federal oversight. Just who is able to get something done to improve passenger rail service? Number three, many host railroads have repeatedly demonstrated a desire to treat passengers as simply another form of freight, and a low priority form at that. My organization was dismayed, but not shocked, to read an August 24, 2017 story in the Journal and Courier that provided evidence of Amtrak passengers being illegally delayed. In an email obtained by the Journal and Courier, a CSX supervisor wrote, quote, "Give high priority to freight trains Q031 and Q032. If we are meeting with Amtrak, make the delay on Amtrak first. If Amtrak is running down one of those trains, go ahead and get to the point. Amtrak is seeing the end of the freight train before we get them around," close quote. Based on the direct experience of my members, we believe this is a common dispatching practice, and not just with CSX. And in the absence of effective oversight, host railroads have failed to live up to contractual agreements establishing minimum OTP. In the summer of 2013, when a DC appeals court invalidated Amtrak's on-time standard, freight interference incidents nearly tripled, and Amtrak's on-time performance plummeted to 42%. The Capital Limited enjoyed, if you can use that word, an on-time performance of only 1.6%. After the Supreme Court restored the standard at the end of 2014, OTP rebounded sharply within days. And that quick recovery suggests that there was no structural basis for the delays, and that dispatching and preference were key drivers. Number four, in light of current dispatching practices and recent court rulings, Congress must take action to strengthen enforcement for passenger protections and clarify regulatory oversight. The evidence is in, and self-regulation hasn't worked. And we're advocating for Congress to strengthen protections for passengers by enshrining the metrics and standards into law for all stations OTP and providing clear thresholds that will allow Amtrak to trigger STB investigations into dispatching practices. These investigations should have clearly defined timelines and, in the event of findings of malpractice, meaningful and significant consequences. Thank you so much for your attention to this matter of critical importance, and we've also included full statements from our regional passenger advocacy allies and appendices to our written statement demonstrating the national scope of this problem, which we will submit in writing for the board's review. Thank you.
Acting Chairman Beckerman, Vice Chairman Miller, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Chris Jagoniski. I am Amtrak's Assistant Vice President of Operations, and I'm here today on behalf of Scott Naparstik, our Chief Operating Officer, who unfortunately was unable to attend today. So, as you know, Amtrak is America's intercity rail passenger provider. We operate the 21,000-mile national passenger rail system, which reaches more than 500 communities in 46 states. Amtrak's national network of passenger trains relies upon our access to host railroad networks. More than 95% of our route mileage is owned, maintained, and dispatched by a railroad other than Amtrak. Even our Northeast Corridor operations, which many people think of as an Amtrak-specific operation, depend on 56 miles of Metro-North Railroad between New Rochelle, New York, and New Haven, Connecticut. Over the last decade, Amtrak has made significant improvements to its cost recovery and general efficiency. Our company's financial position has improved, but increased ridership is heavily dependent on train performance, particularly on-time performance. The handling of our trains by host railroads is a key contributor to our customer satisfaction and consequently to our ridership, revenue, and cost recovery. In recent months, Amtrak's on-time performance has worsened significantly on host carriers. Taken as a whole, the largest single category of delay for our national network trains has been freight train interference. Amtrak trains are performing poorly on several Class 1 hosts. Through August of Amtrak's fiscal year 2017, over 1.7 million passengers arrived late to their destinations on Amtrak trains hosted by CSX. On our Empire service, which connects New York City, Albany, and upstate destinations like Rochester, Buffalo, Toronto, delays caused by CSX freight train interference in August 2017 were 27% higher than the year before. Our Hoosier State service between Indianapolis and Chicago has seen even more dramatic increases in freight train interference, with August 2017 delays up 2,200% against the previous August. In addition, Northeast to Florida Silver Service has suffered from significant freight train interference, resulting in on-time performance that only averaged 30% at all stations for the month of July 2017. To address this, we are pursuing direct engagement at the executive level with our host carriers. One recent example has been the Auto Train, which runs almost entirely on CSX tracks from Norton, Virginia to Sanford, Florida. Earlier this year, on-time performance on the Auto Train was suffering, with trains arriving on schedule well under 50% of the time. Following discussions between senior management at Amtrak and CSX, the Auto Train's performance has improved substantially in recent months, with on-time performance now greater than 70%. The singular example of performance improvement demonstrates that executive engagement is a simple but effective tool to address the rail network performance issues. Amtrak appreciates CSX's senior management attention to the Auto Train's performance, and we look forward to CSX engaging in a similar effort for the Hoosier State, Empire, and also the Silver services. Amtrak works closely with the freight railroads on a daily basis, and we have effective relationships with our counterparts, all of whom are experienced and knowledgeable railroaders. There is, however, some considerable room for improvement, and we believe the Surface Transportation Board can help. Amtrak asks that the STB include Amtrak performance and the steps CSX is taking to improve Amtrak performance in the reporting that the STB is already requiring of CSX. Amtrak believes that regular reporting will provide both an improved level of transparency and a resource to help managers at every level to understand the importance that both the board and Congress attach to Amtrak performance on freight carriers. In conclusion, Amtrak desires strong relationships with all of our host carriers. Amtrak is the country's only national railroad, providing essential passenger service to over 30 million Americans annually. We strongly support the STB's efforts to improve CSX service to the benefit of all users of CSX network, including Amtrak. Amtrak believes executive network-wide engagement are necessary for the national operating efficiency and success, and we believe that the simple step of requiring the host carriers to regularly report on Amtrak performance on their railroads will help us engage successfully. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Chairman Begeman, Vice Chairman Miller, it's an honor to be here today. My name is John Risch, and I'm the elected National Legislative Director for the Smart Transportation Division, the largest of the rail unions in an industry that's about 90% organized. I worked as a locomotive engineer for 30 years, and I'm elected to the position I serve in today. On the CSX, I represent the conductors, brakemen, a lot of the engineers, switchmen, and yard masters, the operating employees. So my remarks here will come from information I've gotten from the field, and I'm really going to focus on just one aspect of why we believe these service disruptions are as severe as they are. And the aspect I'm going to focus on is the long trains that CSX is running. In recent months, CSX has been building and operating extremely long trains, some of them 2 to 3 miles in length. And these long trains, and historically in America, trains are about 1 mile to 1.5 miles long. But these 2 to 3 mile long trains cause lots and lots of issues in operations. First of all, a 3 mile long train is far heavier, has a lot more in-train forces. It's hard, it takes a lot longer to get up to track speed, if it ever gets up to track speed. And when you go from spot to spot and you have to reduce the speed of this train and then increase it, it takes far longer to slow it down and far longer to get it back up to whatever the maximum speed that train is going to be. Most often, it is not track speed. Most rail lines in America are single track main line, meaning they have to have sidings on them for one train to meet an opposing train. When a train is too long for the siding, we have what's called a saw-by. The train heads into the siding, the opposing train waits on the main line, stops, and then the train that headed into the siding heads back out. If both trains are too long for the siding, we have what's called a double saw-by. And to see how you can get by one train by the other in that situation, you can Google a little demonstration on YouTube, and it's a disaster, and it'll take several hours for that to take place. But train operations also, modern train operations, of course, don't have cabooses. We don't have cabooses, but the head of the train has to keep constant communications with the rear end of the train, whether it be distributed power on the rear end of the train or what we call a telemetry device or rear end device, constantly communicating back and forth. I, as a railroad engineer, would need to watch to make sure that my air brake pressure is up to snuff on the back of the train. If it was an emergency situation, I could dynamite the air or set the air on both ends of the train at the same time. So this constant communication is required by regulation and by CSX rule. The longer the train, the more you lose communications with the rear end of your train. And when that happens, by CSX rules, you're required to reduce the speed of that train to 30 miles an hour. If it's in a graded territory, and that means that more than a 2% grade, that train has to stop and comply with other procedures. I have one instance, and I'm going to submit a lot of different stories for the record, one instance where they had communication failure more than 60 times on one run. So they're constantly slowing the train down to 30 miles an hour because the length of the train doesn't allow the radio to communicate that far. The longer the train, the higher probability of mechanical failure. It's as simple as that. The more cars, the more problems. In addition, like I mentioned before, there's slack action. All these trains have a little slack between each cars, and the longer the train goes, the more slack action where the train cars run in and they run out, many times causing derailments. The derailment last week in Atlanta was a 177-car-long train, more than 2 miles long. I don't know why it derailed, but it could very well have been the in-train forces in the train and cause that train to derail. But when a train is disabled for whatever reason, it might be a derailment, it might be just that it broke in two, it might be that an air hose separated. The conductor is forced in, has to leave the lead locomotive and head back to investigate what the problem is. When he's back there with his portable radio, we find that those portable radios are good for about 8,000 feet. The problem is, so he gets out there 8,000 feet or more looking for the problem so he can try and address the problem. And he gets beyond 8,000 feet and he's no longer able to communicate with the locomotive engineers. He might have to put together, take a knuckle out of a car, replace a knuckle or whatever, but in order to communicate with the locomotive engineer, he'll have to walk back up again to get within range of his radio in order to make this communications. Causes tremendous amounts delay. And the longer the train, the harder it is to keep up our brake pipe pressure. I'm from North Dakota, and it cools off there once in a while, and CSX, of course, runs all the way up to New York, to Florida, and other places. But the colder the weather, the harder it is to maintain air brake pipe pressure. When the pressure drops, the cars on the train will automatically apply on their own. So these long trains make it far more challenging to keep the air pressure up and the train moving at what we'd hope to be close to maximum authorized speed, but seldom is because they're far too long. The other thing is many of these CSX engineers are not experienced with handling these super long trains. And as a railroad engineer myself for 30 years, I've operated several of these pretty long trains, and it's a whole different ballgame. Sometimes part of your train is going uphill, part of your train is going downhill, it's slack action is moving in and out, things of that nature. So it's difficult. We've got numerous instances where these trains have been breaking two. One of them was in Florida, and a relatively new engineer left a station in Florida, and I've got the example that I'll submit for the record. Left, train broke in two several times. The last time it broke in two, he blocked an Amtrak passenger train for 9 hours in a siding in the state of Florida. Another problem is when trains travel down the track, they go by wayside warning detectors. These detectors monitor every car. They'll see if one of the cars is making a lot of noise or if there's a hot bearing or a hot wheel or something like that. Once you get out beyond about 13,000 feet, the train crew cannot hear. Oftentimes the radio from the detector does not transfer far enough where the crew can hear whether or not their train is safe to proceed. When that happens, you have to stop the train and ascertain through the dispatcher whether or not the reading was okay to proceed or not. Brake pipe tests. All trains have to have brake pipe tests. Some of the brake pipe tests require that the train be walked. So if you have a 3-mile long train and the conductor has to walk 3 miles with the radio that does not work after 8,000 feet and then walk back 3 miles, you can about imagine how long you've delayed that train and how many crossings you've blocked while you were doing this. We've got instances where trains are too large for foreign rail yard. It's bad enough when a train goes into a CSX yard and it's far too long for the yard. They have to double over to 2 or more tracks, and that clogs up the yard and it causes congestion in the yard. But the example I have is the Beltway Railroad of Chicago only accepts 8,000-foot long trains. However, CSX keeps sending trains that are 9,000 feet or more, and they're rejected. Once they're rejected, the crew has to take it over to Bar Yard and set out enough cars to get down below 8,000 feet, and then return to the Beltway of Chicago. So I guess the question of the day is, what can be done about it? I wrote the Federal Railroad Administration in April of this year about concerns about these super long trains and the problems they're having in regards to safety, blocking crossings, things of that nature. I've gotten no response. We have no FRA administrator. We have one in the wings, but he's not been confirmed, and they're reluctant to do anything over there. So my recommendation to the STB is to issue an order. Issue an order to the CSX and other railroads that you cannot operate a train that's longer than the sidings on the single-track main lines in which you're traveling. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that, you certainly have the power to investigate. So we urge the Surface Transportation Board to conduct an investigation of the effects long train lengths has on customer service and safety in the industry. In closing, I just want to say that I was sitting in the back there, and one of my members texted me from Kentucky, and he said that there's a terminal there where the train masters have now just declared today that there will be no more overtime for road switchers or local service operations. So if you're out there and you're on a road switcher and you have customers to service, and it will result in overtime, you're to ignore the work and head back to the terminal. So I'll try and figure out exactly where that's taking place, but that happened today. That concludes my remarks. It's an honor to be here today, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you all. You may be the fifth panel, but you certainly are as important as the first. Mr. Rich, so there's no actual FRA limit to the length of a train?
There is no FRA limit to the length of
So
the
the
train.
limit is the, I guess, the
practical
creativity of
limits.
Whatever you can
How far
drag
you
down
can
the
push it.
rail.
And how many locomotives do you need for a 3-mile train?
Well, you can, it depends on the weight of the car and the train more than anything. But you can drag quite a few cars around with 2 locomotives. You're just not going to go very fast. The more locomotives you put on, of course, the better opportunity you'll have to get it up to speed. But many times we see not very many locomotives, and yeah, they're not going track speed.
Keep 3-mile trains off the Elston Yard line, please.
And out of Kansas. Like way too many block crossings. Linda, I had a question for you. In your testimony, you were talking about, one of the problems was cars lost in transit. And when you're talking from the perspective of the short lines, are those cars short line cars, customer cars, CSX cars?
Yeah, could be any of those. And, it was interesting, part of what the discussion that we had yesterday at CSX was what's going on with this? Where are these cars? And, what happened? And so what I understand is that in an effort to get these extra cars off of the network, large numbers of cars have been pushed into, various yards or in storage in some area and not necessarily sorted accordingly. So there's not really an effective way to find those lost cars because I think, things happened quickly, equipment was pushed off of the system, and that's, in a lot of cases, that's got to be the empties. And so I don't know that there's the level of accountability that there was once, when that push was put on. I can't speak for CSX, but that's my understanding of what's been going on. And, for our guys, it's just so incredibly important to have access to other people's cars because short lines don't own, the majority of their cars. They're dependent on others usually for those cars. So it's, it's been a real challenge. And also it's really the shortage of cars as well as it's a car problem generally, but the shortage has been very significant for a number of years.
So would this be a correct understanding then, in some cases, one of the reasons why the short lines are so concerned about these lost cars is because they need empty cars to deliver to customers and then don't have the cars they need to deliver?
Yeah, and and sometimes it would be a customer that was expected to have 100 cars a week, and all of a sudden they're down to 20 cars a week. And I think in some cases it's because of, we're not sure exactly where those cars are, but in other cases it's because it has been a choice by CSX to scrutinize very carefully how many cars each one of their customers are going to get going forward in order to create the fluidity that Mr. Harrison was talking about earlier today. It didn't fit into their plan. So, and that creates that cascading effect that others were talking about today onto railroads like my members and their customers. And, it is lost business ultimately.
And for the short lines who, oftentimes are working, I guess you could say, really in partnership with the Class 1 railroads, for your short lines who work with CSX, did they have communications on the operating plan changes? Were they as surprised as some of the shippers have been, at least in terms of what we've heard from shippers?
I think that it depends on which one of the short lines you talk to. I think generally, and CSX has acknowledged that today, there has been the communication has not been at the level that they would have liked it to be at. They were moving very fast. They're trying to make fast changes, and there wasn't a lot of consultation going on. So, yeah, we felt that with our short lines as well. Some of the short lines, things are very smooth. You know, they haven't noticed a blip. Others have been, you know, near decimated by the changes. So it really depends on what the master plan was for CSX on the network, whether or not you were going to be dealt out. It wasn't anything intentional, but, you know, for some of our guys, they just were kind of dealt out.
You sort of alluded to this, but do you have any member short lines that are literally on the brink of being out of business as a consequence of these changes? I mean, the impact on them has been so severe.
We didn't ask the question that way. I had been talking to one of my members the other day who has been required on very short notice to move an interchange, and the impact of that annually is going to be something like $750,000 a year. So it's things like that. There's really not, you know, a common trend among each one of the railroads. Again, it depends on what the plan was.
Does that mean change the location of where it occurs?
Yeah, where they were interchanging with CSX for whatever reason.
And Chris, could I ask you a question? I think you said at the outset that this summer, across the board with the rail network, regardless of which class one it was, you've seen a slowdown. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct. Nationwide, our performance is down across all our services, across everything. There's a variety of reasons for that. You know, in some cases, you know, back earlier in the year, there was some tremendous weather issues up in the Pacific Northwest and snow. And so some of that's, there's a variety of reasons going on, but system-wide, we're down for the fiscal year. Over the fiscal year, our performance is down across the board.
And then considering the topic of today's hearing, if you look just exclusively at the CSX network where Amtrak is operating, have you seen, you used some numbers, but I'm sorry, I have to say I kind of got a little bit, you know, lost in the various numbers, but have you seen an impact on Amtrak's on-time performance that appears to be specifically related to the changes made by CSX?
Yes, our on-time performance is definitely down on the CSX lines. You know, that being said, just to be clear, you know, Bob had mentioned some stuff earlier in the day, and, you know, I kind of talked about it a little bit. There are some pockets of improvement we're beginning to see. You know, we've had some conversations back in May, for example, about our auto train performance, and it was pretty poor. Okay, yeah, they made some commitments, and the auto train really improved significantly, and we acknowledge that. We appreciate their help with that. You know, we've been talking to them. There's some other, you know, steps that they're taking throughout their network, and we've talked about it. The Hoosier State, which I quoted in the testimony here, has been very poor. I mean, there was a large percentage increase in delays. However, some changes were made very, very recently. And so, you know, so we've seen in the last, I'm just going to say in the last few weeks, let's say, we've actually seen some improvements in that area, and that was the next area they committed to do. So, you know, we have to acknowledge that. Now, you know, that being said, what we want to be able to do is to make sure, though, that, you know, that's a trend in the good direction, but we want to make sure that change is sustained, you know, and that good performance is sustained going through it. And we've been talking to them about, you know, what our next priority would be, for example, would be the silver service. That's our New York to Florida market. A lot of I-95 people, especially it's a big, heavy season for us. I mean, you have green peak season. This is the peak season for all the snowbirds starting to go to Florida now, you know, and, you know, they're making some commitments. They're going to be making some changes, and, you know, we're going to look forward to, A, getting those changes completed, and B, how do we work on to make sure that's sustained over time? So it's not just, you know, because all the attention's on it, that's nice, and we really do appreciate that, but just let's make sure that we can sustain it going forward. And they're committed to do that, so we're going to be anxious to work with them to make that happen.
Mr. Matthews, so that you don't feel left out, I'm curious, did you have a leg up because your name was Jim?
No.
Jim Repass was the longtime president, so I was...
None of our organization, ma'am.
Well, we still are going to hear again from CSX, so thank you all for your comments. And Cindy, we look forward to having a chance to hear from you.
All right, thanks, Ann. We would like to take the opportunity here to thank the board, our customers and stakeholders.
Excuse me, Cindy, before you get started, for our court reporter, could you both say your names so he can get them in the
Cindy
record?
Sanborn.
Bob Frula.
Okay. So again, we'd like to thank the board, our customers, and other stakeholders for this opportunity to talk about our company's implementation of precision scheduled railroading. We've heard a lot of concerns from our customers today and acknowledges the challenges that they've been facing for the last several months. And as Hunter said earlier today, we do apologize for that. But we do feel like precision scheduled railroading will take us to a better place than we've been in the past, and our customers will be very pleased with the results of our efforts as we move this model into place. We have heard through some of the discussion today, I do want to mention this, while I don't think this is the right forum for talking about, alternative regulatory proposals, I know that has been a topic that we have heard from a number of constituents that have spoken today, and we would just say that I don't want to spend time with that. I want to talk about the service challenges. That is for another time and date, and where I think we would get a better cross-section of feedback on that particular topic, but I'm not going to, get into those kind of details. Over the last several months, a dedicated team of our commercial and customer service representatives have personally reached out to the customers who indicated they would participate today to better understand their issues and to help resolve the concerns that they've raised. We appreciate the ongoing dialogue we have had with them and take to heart the comments we have heard. And we've made great strides in addressing many of the concerns that our customers have raised, but there's a couple of points that we have heard loudly and clearly through a number of people that have spoken around communication ahead of time. And then as issues become apparent, our customer service group and who the contact people are to be able to get some support or information to understand, what we're doing and how it's going to affect them and how we can solve the problem at the time.
Cindy, how many customer service representatives do you have?
Off the top of my head, I don't know unless you do.
We have 46 clerical contract employees, and then there's another 40 managers.
Spread out around the country?
All in
around your network, I guess.
In our customer, no, that is in our customer service center in Jacksonville, Florida.
And they do cover.
How many did you have before?
I think that's reduced from, it was around 120. And
they do cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we do have coverage beyond just the regular normal daytime hours.
Well, I've been curious about this, and a lot of questions have come up. So is the way that customer service works that it's a service center and you call the customer service center and you get whoever answers the phone, or are customer service people assigned to particular segments of the industry? So if I'm a coal person, there's a customer service person I go to. If I'm a grain person, it's someone else?
We have some commodities. Coal has a group that responds to coal issues. Then our customer service center is broken down into regional areas. And so if it's a customer in New York, they call the Northeast Customer Service. Their call is routed to that group.
Okay. As we continue our transition into precision scheduled railroading, you've asked on our weekly calls for us to provide information to you, which is publicly disclosed, and we are seeing improvements in the overall network performance. We understand that on an individual customer basis, there may be some differences in how they see it, and we are very interested in solving those problems as we get the specific understanding of where the challenges reside. Relative to transit, we track that as well, and we look again at a network perspective, overall transit of our merchandise service product, and we have seen a return to actually better than transit time since the first quarter of this year. Since the hurricane, really, I think one of the really good proof points for us was as we went through the challenges that Hurricane Irma brought to us, we did not really see a degradation in transit. And since we have gotten through all of the recovery components of that very large storm, we're actually seeing transit continue down. So we feel like we have made some improvements. These are very real time up through the first of this month, and are watching that very carefully. I'd also like to highlight, while we heard a number of concerns from our customers today, we have remarks from customers that are pleased with our service. We have provided that information as part of the docket, and I think it is important for us to recognize that there are people that have seen a true improvement in their service since we've implemented precision scheduled railroading in their area. We will continue the dialogue we've had with the board, and we'll keep the board apprised of the progress we are making in implementing our new operating plan, which we remain confident will provide lasting value for our customers, the communities that we serve, shareholders, and our employees. And it's been a long day, but Bob and I are glad to answer any additional questions that you have for us.
It has been a long day, and we appreciate not just CSX, but also all of the shippers and association representatives and stakeholders. Thank you for joining us today. We really wanted to hear, we talked to a lot of you informally, but we also wanted to have a chance to hear from you in an informal, formal way. It's not over, but we greatly appreciate Mr. Harrison being here for the first part of this long day. We appreciate his clear acknowledgement of the missteps, and I think that we will once again stress, communicate with your shippers, communicate with the board when you need to, but your shippers are extremely important, and we will continue to ask for plans for what your next steps are.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and let me say to all of you who have participated, certainly both CSX and their various employees, but all of the shippers, really, today's exceeded my expectations in terms of the fulsomeness of the testimony, the people who participated. It's been a very interesting day, and I appreciate that everyone is willing to take the time out of their schedule, and want to say to the CSX employees, days like this are never any fun at all. You always handle it with a great deal of professionalism, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.